moving from a sedentary to a physically active societal way of life. This is Up on Our Feet.
Welcome to Up on Our Feet. It's a worldwide concern. Fewer than 20% of the world's children and youth get the recommended amount of 60 minutes a day of moderate to vigorous physical activity. And in reality, this recommended amount of physical activity by the World Health Organization doesn't even come close to how much daily physical activity is actually needed to maximize physical health, mental health, and cognition, how our brain works. And while certainly well-intentioned, this concern is also playing out in schools worldwide, where students are getting less and less physical activity and more sedentary class time in an effort to boost academic test scores. This trend has been going on for quite some time, despite the fact that over the past several decades, an overwhelming amount of research has conclusively demonstrated that the more physically active children are, the healthier they are, the happier they are, and the higher their academic performance. It's as if schools everywhere are operating on the wrong side of humanity. And why is this so? Because research also tells us that over millions of years of evolution, human beings have been genetically programmed to be physically active, not sedentary. Yes, we have evolved to be physically active, not sedentary, but the world's schools basically operate in a sedentary manner, meaning students sitting at their desks for most of the learning school day. And this creates a mismatch between our genetic makeup and how we live our lives, including how we educate our children. This issue of how physical activity or exercise positively impacts the brain, including having a positive effect on students' academic performance, is the subject of a recently published paper entitled "Exercise Keeps the Brain Healthy." And this very topic is a major focus of study of the paper's lead author, Professor Raine. Professor Raine is in the Department of Physical Therapy, Movement and Rehabilitation Sciences, and the Department of Medical Sciences in the Bouvet College of Health Sciences at Northeastern University in Boston. Professor Raine is also a member of the university's renowned Center for Cognitive and Brain Health. Professor Raine, it's nice to have you with us.
Hi, Joel. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Okay. As just mentioned in the introduction, there have been so many research studies and papers published on how physical activity positively impacts the brain and how this relates to enhanced academic performance in school children. And the recently published paper, "Exercise Keeps the Brain Healthy," that you and your fellow co-authors wrote, isn't so much a research study, but rather an explanation of how this happens, and it's explained in everyday language. With all the research studies that are out there, what led you to produce this kind of paper?
Thanks. That's a great question. And I'm really kind of excited to talk to you about this paper and these findings. So, like you noted, there are a bunch of research studies out there that have examined exercise and brain health, specifically in kids, but very rarely do we as researchers actually get a chance to write and explain these findings to the public. So in my case, I was really interested in writing this paper because it was going to be published for kids to read. And since I've worked with kids for the last 15 years, they've been participants in all of my studies. I thought it would be a really great way to explain some of our studies to kids who have been our participants for kids themselves. So in addition, I also just think it's really important to get science out to the public in a way that's digestible and understandable. And so since the world is flooded with information and places to get scientific information, I thought writing this manuscript and kind of getting this article published would be a great way to let kids and parents and teachers know about some really scientifically trusted ideas and make the research that we do really understandable for kids.
Okay, good for you. So before we look at the different topics covered in the paper, let's start off with the paper's overall message. And that message is
So simply put, that message is that exercise, both acutely, and by that I mean in the short term, and chronically, and by that I mean kind of over the long term, over a number of months, is beneficial for kids' brain function and cognition. So we know that exercise is good for kids' cognition, or cognition is also known as their thoughts or behaviors, kind of shapes how they make decisions and go about their day. And we've seen that these benefits in terms of cognition and brain function actually extend all the way into the classroom in terms of their performance on academic achievement tests. So the research team that I'm a part of has conducted a number of studies and found that just short bouts of exercise, roughly 20 minutes, can help kids inhibit distractions, remember items, and perform better on math and reading performance measures. And then if we look at the long-term effects, so we've shown that within 9 months of a physical activity intervention, we see improvements in the structure and the function of children's brains. And we don't see these same improvements with a control group who didn't get the physical activity intervention. So taken together, we can kind of surmise these effects to say physical activity is good for kids, and it extends all the way down to function, all the way up to academic performance. So things we can see with, just regular performance measures like math and spelling or math and reading tests.
Okay. In particular, you focus on aerobic activity and how it impacts the brain. Why this particular form of exercise?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me first describe what aerobic physical activity is. So aerobic physical activity gets large muscles moving typically. So think like your arms and your legs, and it makes your heart beat faster than when you're just, say, sitting or resting. Aerobic activity also tends to make you breathe harder. And it's thought that after or over time, regular aerobic activity may make your heart healthier and your lungs stronger. So we started with this type of exercise because there's been a bunch of research in the animal world to show that aerobic activity positively impacts the brain of rodents. So we thought, okay, let's see if we can extend these findings to look at whether aerobic activity is beneficial to the brain of children, of humans. And it turns out it is. So that's kind of why we started in this field. And also, I work with kids, and many kids already engage in, although not the recommended levels, some amount of aerobic activity. So encouraging the promotion of these activities even more so seemed like a logical place to start. Kids can be aerobically active, like playing tag or chase at recess, or dancing, or playing basketball, jumping rope. These are all different ways, and a bunch of others, that kids can be aerobically active, that are like already kind of normal behaviors for many children.
Okay, so you just mentioned all the different ways that the kids can be aerobically active. The question that comes to mind for me is then, if they're running around like this, how do you actually measure what's going on in their brain when they're being aerobically active? How do you actually do this?
Yeah, so we do this a few ways. So sometimes we measure what the brain is doing actually during exercise, and sometimes we measure what the brain is doing before and after. We look for changes in what the brain is doing, but from after an exercise bout. And what we typically use in my research, we've used a number of techniques. The one that I kind of tend to focus on involves EEG, and then I have some colleagues that work in MRI and fMRI. They're both really unique and really great ways to study how the brain works. And they both have different benefits. So they both can be used in different ways to measure how the brain responds to exercise. So obviously you can't have a kid run around with a big MRI machine on their head. That's not possible. In contrast, we can put what's called an EEG cap on kids and have them be active and measure what their brain is doing with an EEG cap on their head. So EEG is nice because it lets us record the brain's electrical activity and look at basically how this electrical activity changes with exercise and how it changes after exercise. The brain has electrical activity because of the neurons that are kind of moving around the nervous system, and these are like the nerve cells of the body, and they basically carry messages around the brain. And the billions and billions of these neurons that we have can create electrical activity, very, very small amounts, but we have special EEG caps that let us measure how much electrical activity the brain is going on in the brain at a given time. So like I said, that lets us measure kind of what people are doing in the moment. We can also use MRI and fMRI that basically look at how blood changes and how blood flows through the body, or through the brain specifically in our case. And again, these are done more before exercise. Then we have kids exercise, and then after exercise, we can put them back in the MRI scanner. We can measure the changes in the brain that have happened potentially because of the exercise they've just done. Both of these are really non-invasive, and they're great ways to measure what kids are doing that have relatively few like restrictions in terms of who can be included, which is a great way to be inclusive of a whole variety of different kids and different activities.
Okay, this is really interesting. So when you're doing all this with the MRIs, the EEGs, and the kids are wearing the cap, right? So what actually gets measured in the brain? What brain functions are you examining? You talked about the effects of blood flow and things like this, but what brain functions then develop or enhance as a result of all this?
Yeah, so we've looked at a number of brain functions. The most common ones we've looked at are what are called executive functions. And these are things like inhibition, or the ability to ignore distraction and pay attention to a singular item, working memory, holding multiple things in your mind at one time, and cognitive flexibility. So switching between doing one task and then doing another. The example I give of that for my students is their ability to pay attention to my lecture and also scroll their phone, right? We don't do that very well, and kids really struggle to do that because their brain just isn't fully developed yet. So those are the functions from a cognitive side that we're measuring while kids have either the EEG cap on them or are in the MRI scan having scans done. So we're looking at how the brain is changing while it's doing these tasks, following, in our case, frequently like a bout of exercise.
Okay, so you just mentioned what the inhibitory control, or the inhibition, and that enables the kid to focus better and block out distractions, right? And then there's the flexibility, where they're able to multitask or do several things at one time. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. And then the memory, how does it work with memory? What actually goes on in the brain where through the aerobic activity, they're improving their memory?
Yeah, so that's a great question. With memory, there's a whole bunch of different types of memory, but if we think about memory broadly speaking, one area of the brain that's really important for memory is a region of the brain called the hippocampus. And we have some research that has shown a few things. So one, we've shown that children that are higher fit have larger hippocampi than their lower fit peers. So that suggests that if we can improve someone's fitness, maybe we can change the structure of their MRI that might then help them learn or remember items better. We've also shown changes in hippocampal structure following that 9-month bout of physical activity. So we've seen different changes in the hippocampus structure for the kids that were in our physical activity intervention compared to those that weren't. So that's really exciting, because this is a structure of the brain specifically that research has suggested is really important for memory. And we can see in kids that if we have them do physical activity, we see benefits to that specific structure. So it's a really interesting region of cognition to be studying.
Okay, then pulling all this together, how do these brain functions, executive functions of inhibition, memory, flexibility, what do they have to do with impacting academic performance in school children? What's going on here?
Yeah, so that's for one, there's a lot of research still going on in this field because there's a lot of different caveats of academic achievement and whether we measure it in actual school settings with standardized achievement tests by state, or whether we measure it in the lab, and who's designed the tests. But broadly speaking, right, you can imagine that inhibition lets you suppress irrelevant information, pay attention to important cues in the environment, maybe ignore distractions. So in a classroom, if you are better at inhibiting these distractions, if you're better at ignoring your classmate who might be making funny noises while your teacher is trying to give a lesson, you're probably going to learn more from that lesson than your classmate who's making funny noises, or from a classmate who can't stop listening to these funny noises, right? So it kind of, the inhibitory control piece we think is very important for being able to pay attention in class. But executive functions across the board, we know, shape multiple cognitive and mental health outcomes throughout an individual's life. So inhibitory control is just one aspect, but it's the one that we've kind of studied the most in relation to acute exercise and tasks, or say inhibition after exercise. So we know also that executive function and inhibition also provide this foundation, obviously, like I've been saying, for learning and academic achievement. So if we can help them, if exercise can help them inhibit this irrelevant information, there's a thought that this could be what's helping them learn better and then perform better on these academic achievement tests.
Okay. And then I assume the impact of physical activity, especially aerobic activity, regarding learning or memory is the other function you mentioned. This has to do with the hippocampus again. And so how does this happen? How does the physical activity impact the hippocampus that leads to improved academic performance?
So again, these are all mechanistic these are all mechanism proposed, right? We don't really know exactly what physical activity is doing to the hippocampus, and then exactly what the hippocampus is doing to physical activity. But we think that physical activity might be creating this like ideal environment, right? Whether it be through a variety of different cellular activities that are going on, or through increased blood flow from the physical activity. Those are still relatively unknown exactly what the physical activity is doing specifically to the hippocampus. I can tell you that we have data that has shown not only does physical activity impact learning and memory, but just being higher fit helps kids learn and remember better. So we have data that children who are higher fit remember regions of a map better the next day when we quiz them on them than their peers who are lower fit. So this suggests that there might be something going on in the hippocampus that could be different between higher fit and lower fit kids that could impact how they're able to remember and then recall the information the next day.
Mm-hmm. Okay. A lot of potential here, isn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some ongoing work too, but hasn't been published, or studies aren't quite done yet. So
right. In your paper, you mentioned how this research has been around for at least 20 years. What are your thoughts on why educators continue to limit the amount of physical activity for students in schools, despite what the research is showing? Have you thought about this?
I have. I shouldn't say it keeps me up at night, but it almost keeps me up at night because I think a lot of the fault or the reason lies on researchers not getting this information out to the schools, right? We're not getting it to the people who really, really need this information, and not to the public places that we need it to be. So I'll take some of the blame as a researcher. I probably do a poor job communicating or getting my science out to teachers and superintendents. It's something we're working on. And it's honestly one of the reasons I thought that it'd be really nice to speak to you, because hopefully somebody somewhere is listening, and it might kind of spur one teacher to change their behaviors in the classroom. And so I think that's part of it. And the other part is teachers I think are just chronically stretched too thin, and their time is extremely precious. And most schools, right, it's not really at the teacher. Some of these decisions are at the teacher's discretion, but oftentimes it's the schools that just don't have the luxury of having PE teachers and staff trained in how to effectively get kids active. So classroom teachers have not actually been trained in pedagogy and how to get kids active in good ways that make people feel included and have fun and want to continue it. So, you're asking teachers who have had no training in this to get kids active. That'd be like asking somebody, off the street, how do you teach a kid to read? Well, it's not as easy as people might seem to think it is. So we've tasked teachers with trying to think of not only like how do we teach kids to read and learn math, but also how do we get kids active that is both creative and fun, inclusive, and classroom space adaptable. But also it can't cost any money because there's no money for anything, and especially physical activity. So I think it really comes down to they haven't done it because I haven't done a good job disseminate, not just me, right? Research, it's hard to disseminate the research we do in the university, in the scientific publications out to teachers. And then I think it's just that teachers don't have the support that they need to do it, right? I don't think a teacher would say no to getting help with how to get their kids active, but asking them to do that on top of all the other things we've asked teachers to do in today's world is just a really heavy lift and something that they're not, they weren't trained for.
Okay. In your response that you just gave, it was almost like a passing thought where you said, money is an issue. And you said, especially for physical education. Why? Meaning it would be easier to get money for math or language arts or something. Why do you think that is? Do you have any thoughts about why it's easier to get money for math or language arts, but not for physical activity that really, from what you're saying and all the research that's there, is the foundation for cognition and health, physical health, mental health, academic performance? Why do you think that's so, that it's tougher to get money for physical activity than mental or academic kinds of?
Yeah. No, I mean, I personally think if we gave money for physical activity and physical education, you would see benefits in all sorts of academic performance for kids. But I think part of it is just that people largely, I think being active and teaching physical activity is easy. So why should we have to give money for it? Whereas we know it's not, right? Like it's hard to get myself, right? For me to get motivated and find what activity I want to do that day. And that's just for me, one person getting myself motivated, not me, one person trying to get a classroom of, depending on the state, 20 to 30 kids all active. So I think there's there's this inherent idea that like, well, physical activity should be free and it should be easy to teach and it shouldn't really have to cost anything. But we know to have good quality education and good quality physical activity instruction, it does cost money. It does take training. There's a reason it's a degree at the university level, is because it is something that is not just inherent. So I think that's part of it. Yeah, and I'd say a lot of our state regulations and how states get to spend money in the school districts is not dependent on their physical health, right? It's dependent on their performance on math and reading and a host of other academic performance variables. So schools get or lose money based on those metrics. So that's probably why they're getting money or not getting money in those metrics, because that's what determines if they get the money.
Yeah. Okay, so in this context, do you have any thoughts on what it will take to have schools everywhere follow the science and embrace the research that you and so many others have done and increase rather than decrease the amount of physical activity for the students to enhance their academic achievement and at the same time improve their physical health and social emotional behavior?
Yeah. So, I mean, I hope that we can get these findings out there. I truly think that if most school administrators knew that just 20 minutes of walking had the potential to help their students stay focused in the classroom and improve their academic performance by almost a grade level, actually, most of our data suggests, I think they would take more effort. So I think it's going to take a lot of, from the research side, us getting the information to the superintendents, to the people who make decisions about how money and time is spent. And so I think that's one area, is I think in order to do this, we have to get the data to the people that need it. And then I also think we have to think about, how do we creatively add in little bits or small amounts of physical activity to the school day. So the evidence that we have for the cognitive benefits, but also just if you look at the physical activity guidelines for Americans, say that in kids, it doesn't even matter. They don't have to accumulate these bouts in 20 minutes for there to be physical benefits, right? Any little bit of physical activity is beneficial for their health. So maybe asking a teacher to take 20 minutes out of their day is too big of a chunk, right? Maybe that's an entire math lesson. But maybe we have to think creatively about how we add in small amounts. So maybe a walking club before school or a walking club after school. And I think these recommendations and these programs need to be guided by trained people in childhood physical education. So pedagogists, PE teachers, etc., and not just fall as another responsibility for the classroom teachers, because that's not sustainable, because there are only so many hours in the day for them. So I think a lot of it comes down to trying to think creatively about how we add small amounts. And then also, this might be very basic or a very obvious answer, but like, all of this takes time, money, trained personnel, commitments, well thought out plans. So I think those are kind of the main things that it'll take. But I think a lot of it falls on the researchers to get it to the superintendents, or maybe not superintendents, but the people who make decisions at the school level for kids to get these activities back. And then I guess I'd just say, as another basic, more and more schools are trying to cut things like PE and recess, specifically for kids who might need it most. So the kids who are misbehaving in the lunchroom are oftentimes the last ones let out for research, or sorry, not let out for research, who are let out for PE or for recess. And most data would suggest that that's really not a great idea, right? Those kids are probably they just really need to get some physical activity, and then maybe they'll be better at inhibiting distractions and staying focused on what they're supposed to be doing. So I think those are kind of a number of small little changes that could be made, both within a certain school and kind of broadly speaking.
Okay, that was a great answer, and you delineated a lot of things. Final question. Over the course of your professional career, and with all the studies and projects you've done regarding the positive impact of physical activity on cognition, in the big picture of things, what's the big message, the big takeaway, the major conclusion you've come to?
I guess I'd say the big takeaway is that physical activity, exercise, is good for children's brain development, their cognition, and their academic achievement. Whether that physical activity be in a short bout, 20 minutes, or a long amount, 9 months, we've seen that physical activity is beneficial for children's cognitive and brain health. I think more research definitely needs to be done to kind of titrate out exactly what types and doses gets us optimal performance. But at a very basic level, we know that physical activity is good for the brain. And so we should really be trying to promote and encourage kids and families and parents caregivers, teachers, etc., to get out there and be active with their kids, right? Because we also know that physical activity isn't just good for the brains of kids. We know it's good for older adults. We know it's good for a lot of different people. And so if we can get people, right, my specific interest is kids, but people moving, we might start to see some benefits in terms of how they perform in day-to-day activities that are optimized with physical activity.
Okay. Professor Lauren Raine of Northeastern University, thanks for being with us on Up on Our Feet.
Thanks for having me.